What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
My parents told me they were too busy to come to my banquet, and I remember staring at the message on my phone for a long time, trying to convince myself that it wasn't really a big deal, that maybe they had something unavoidable come up, that it wasn't personal. I even told myself that this was just one night, and that I'd be fine because I was used to them missing things, but the truth is I wasn't fine. I had been working toward this award for years, and I wanted nothing more than to see their faces in the audience, to know that even once they could set everything else aside to show up for me. Instead, they wrote the words, "too busy," like it was just another casual excuse, like I was asking them to run to the store instead of show up to a milestone in my life. I had this sinking feeling in my chest, but I didn't say anything back. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't try to remind them that this night was important to me. I just stayed quiet because I already knew what would happen. If I pressed the issue, they'd make me feel like I was being dramatic, like I was selfish for wanting their attention. That has always been the pattern in my family. My brother Ethan has always been their center of gravity, the one who gets the endless rides, the attention, the money, the cheers at every game. And me? I was the one who learned to clap for myself when no one else did. I told myself silence was strength, that not letting them see me upset gave me a sense of control, but it didn't feel like control. It felt like I was swallowing glass. Later that same day, when I was scrolling through my phone just trying to distract myself, I saw the photos. My parents had posted pictures from Ethan's golf outing. They were standing with him at the course, smiling, celebrating, bragging about his hard work. I stared at those pictures for what felt like forever, my hands shaking. They weren't too busy. They had just decided that my moment didn't matter as much as his. They chose to stand on grass clapping for his swing instead of sitting in a banquet hall where their daughter was about to be recognized for years of effort. And it hit me in the gut because it wasn't even about golf, it was about the pattern. They always had time for Ethan. Always. I could hear their excuses in my head before they even said them. We already committed. It was just one night. You know your brother needs support right now. Those lines had been repeated in different forms for years. Every time I asked for them to show up, every time they brushed me aside with that condescending tone that made it seem like I was the unreasonable one. I wanted to scream, to call them out, to finally lay out everything they had ever done to make me feel small, but instead, I sat there in silence. Because I knew that nothing I said in that moment would change them. They would twist it into me being jealous or bitter, and honestly, maybe I was, but I also knew I was right. The thing about silence is that it builds, it festers, it turns into something sharper the longer you hold it. I told myself I would just get through the night, sit at that banquet alone, clap for the winners, and go home with my certificate. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to let it slide this time. I couldn't. Because something inside me snapped when I saw those pictures of them cheering for Ethan. I realized they had written me off completely, and if I didn't do something about it, they always would. So I said nothing to them directly. I smiled at the few friends who asked if my parents were coming, and I lied, saying they had another commitment. I told myself to hold it together, to act like it didn't matter. But in my head, I was planning. I didn't know what form it would take yet, but I knew I wasn't going to walk onto that stage, take my award, and pretend everything was fine. I was done pretending. That night, as I lay in bed rehearsing what I might say if I got the chance, I realized this wasn't about the award anymore. It was about drawing a line, about finally saying the words I had swallowed for years. I didn't want to make a scene, but I also knew if I stayed silent, they'd never get it, they'd never feel even a fraction of what I'd felt. For once, I wanted them to be the ones caught off guard, the ones uncomfortable, the ones who couldn't spin the story to make me look like the problem. So I kept my silence until the moment that mattered. And I promised myself that when my name was called, I wouldn't just stand there smiling politely and thanking people while my parents sat comfortably at a golf course. I would make them remember this night in a way they couldn't ignore. And that's exactly what I did. I got to the banquet early because I could not stand the idea of walking in late and doing that awkward scan for a familiar face that would not be there anyway, so I checked in, picked up my name card, and found my table near the side where it was quiet enough to hear my thoughts, which at that point were not helpful. because they kept looping back to the same message and the same photos and the same old pattern that I kept excusing until it became ridiculous even to me. People drifted in with their parents and partners and a few proud grandparents, and I listened to the little bursts of laughter and the kind of small talk that always happens at these things, and I kept telling myself I would be fine, that I had friends here. That achievement does not need an audience to be real, even though what I wanted most in the world in that moment was proof that my family knew I mattered without me having to explain it like a customer service complaint. When the student coordinator came around with programs and asked if I needed anything, I heard my own voice say yes before I even formed the plan, and I asked for 2 blank place cards because some guests were running late, and I said it casually, like it was nothing, and she smiled and handed them over without a second thought. I sat there with a pen and wrote Mom on one and Dad on the other as neatly as I could, and I put them on the 2 empty settings beside me, and it was petty, and it was small, and it felt amazing. Because sometimes you need to mark the absence in a way that even you cannot ignore anymore. I took a quick photo of the table and posted it to my story with a simple line that said, "Saved you a seat." No hashtags, no performance, just the truth sitting there in black ink. And I locked my phone and set it face down like I had finally slid a heavy box back onto the right shelf. A couple of classmates stopped by to say hi and to ask the question I knew was coming, and I gave the same answer I always give, that they had a conflict, that everything was fine, that I was just glad to be there. And they nodded in that way people do when they hear a story that does not match the picture in front of them, and then they moved on to their families, which is what they should do, and I stayed with my water and my program and those 2 little place cards that felt like anchors, holding me steady in my own version of the night. I saw the dean talking with a group of faculty, and I watched my advisor spot me and give a small wave that felt like a hand on my shoulder. And I told myself to breathe and to be proud and to remember that I earned the right to sit in that room whether anyone chose to witness it or not. Of course, I broke my rule and checked my phone, because I am still human, and there they were again. New photos from the course, a boomerang of my brother grinning with the caption "Proud of our guy," and a shot of my parents at a table with drinks and bright smiles, and a story from my brother that said "Family Day" with a string of familiar faces that never seemed to include mine unless I was the one holding the camera at a holiday. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from shame this time but from a kind of clarity that I wish had arrived years ago, and I slid the phone away because I knew if I stared any longer I would start editing my feelings down to something easier to swallow. And I was done doing that for them. The MC tapped the microphone and the room settled, and we went through the motions of welcome and gratitude and the early awards. And I clapped hard for people I liked and even for people I barely knew because their families were losing their minds with happiness, and it was contagious in the best way. And while I clapped, I rehearsed a line under my breath that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I saw those golf photos, a line that was not cruel and not theatrical, but firm enough to make the point I had swallowed for too long. A text popped up from Ethan that said, "Heard you have some big thing tonight. Hope it goes well," and I stared at that sentence for a long beat because it was exactly the tone he always used. Friendly enough to sound supportive while still letting me know that my milestone was a side note in a day built around him. I typed thanks and nothing else, not a smile, not a question, because there was nothing left to discuss that would not end with me performing gratitude to protect their comfort. They announced the final category and gave a little speech about sustained excellence and leadership and all the usual phrases that are supposed to make the moment feel big, and then I heard my name. And for half a second the room went silent in my head, and all I could hear was my own pulse and the thought that this was the exact minute I had been moving toward since I wrote those 2 little cards. I stood, I straightened my program, I touched the edges of the place cards the way you touch a bruise to remind yourself that the pain is real, and I took a breath that felt like a promise I owed only to myself, because I was done making promises to people who treated my life like a scheduling inconvenience. I started toward the stage with the line fully formed and the decision already made, and I knew that once I said it, there would be no going back to the old arrangement where I shrank to fit their comfort, which, honestly, was the point. Walking toward the stage felt like walking through every version of myself that had learned to swallow things, because with each step I could hear all the times I had softened my voice, trimmed my needs, and handed credit to people who barely showed up. And by the time I reached the stairs, I had already decided that I was not going to hand over this moment to politeness or to the fear of being labeled difficult. So I straightened the program in my hand the way you study a thought, thanked the usher with a nod, and reminded myself that those two empty place cards at my table were not a cry for sympathy. They were a record of the truth, and the truth deserved a microphone just as much as my achievements did. The MC shook my hand and said congratulations with that careful warmth people use when they can tell something bigger is happening under the surface, and I took the plaque and turned to the room. And for a beat, I just stood there breathing like a person finally standing up inside their own skin. Then I started the speech I had practiced in pieces over the years without even realizing it. I thanked my advisor for never treating my questions like a burden. I thanked a few classmates who kept me sane in the group projects. I thanked the staff who always remembered my name at the library desk and who reminded me that effort is noticed even when it is quiet, and I could feel the room settling into that familiar rhythm of polite applause between sentences, which is where most speeches live and die, in the safe middle. I let the safe middle pass by me, and then I stopped, not for drama, but because the words I was about to say needed a full breath behind them, and when I spoke again my voice sounded like mine in a way I had not heard in a long time. I said that tonight mattered, not because of a title on a certificate, but because of the years that led to it, the hours that no one posted about, the weekends that did not look glamorous, the setbacks that did not come with a cheering section. And I said that the people who show up for those quiet parts are the ones who deserve the loud parts. Then I looked at the back row where there were only strangers and empty chairs, and I said the line that had been burned into me since the moment I saw the golf photos. For those who did not think this mattered, stay home next time too. There was a silence that landed like a held breath, the kind that makes you check if you have gone too far or not far enough, and then the room reacted in a way I did not expect, because instead of the awkward coughs or the shift of discomfort, there was this low wave of agreement moving through the crowd, and I saw people nodding like they knew exactly what I meant, and the applause that followed did not feel like noise. It felt like a room saying, "We heard you, and you are not crazy." The MC recovered with a quick line about courage. My advisor stood the way only someone who has watched you grind can stand, and a couple of parents at a nearby table raised their glasses with a look that said their kids had dragged them here before. But they were glad to be dragged. I finished by dedicating the award to anyone who has ever saved a seat that stayed empty and still did the work anyway, and I meant it, because I have always refused to turn my frustration into meanness toward people who did show up, and I will not start now. Even if my words landed like a slap in a house that has ignored the quiet for years. I handed the microphone back, shook hands again, and as I stepped off the stage I felt this clean kind of relief, not the sugary kind that fades in an hour, but the steady kind that comes from acting in alignment with what you know is true. Even if you pay for it later at Sunday dinner or in a phone call filled with accusations about respect. When I reached my table, my phone lit up with a row of messages from classmates and cousins and even an aunt who never picks sides, and while I did not open any of them yet, the previews told me enough. Because they were short lines like "proud of you" and "about time," and I felt that one in my bones, and it hit me that the power of saying it out loud is not only about the person who hurt you hearing it, it is about the people who needed permission to say it for themselves. I set the plaque down next to the two little cards, took a drink of water to steady the flood of adrenaline that always follows a risky choice, and told myself that whatever came next, I would handle it without backtracking. Because backtracking is how I got stuck in the first place. I looked up to find my advisor heading my way with that concerned half-smile that teachers use when they want to check whether you are okay, and behind her, at the far end of the room near the exit, I caught sight of someone I did not expect to see. Because there he was, my brother, still flushed from whatever he had rushed from, standing stiff with his hands in his pockets and a look that said he had heard enough to be furious, which is when I understood that the speech was only the opening move and that the real conversation was going to happen off stage, away from polite applause, in a place where he would not be able to hide behind a caption or a crowd. When the banquet finally ended and I walked out of that hall, I could already feel the tension buzzing under my skin, because I knew that word of what I had said would not stay confined to those four walls. My phone started vibrating before I even got outside, the kind of constant stream that makes you know a storm has already broken loose. The first message was from my mother, who wrote that my speech was unnecessarily cruel and that she was embarrassed by my behavior, which almost made me laugh out loud. Because the idea that she could be embarrassed by an event she refused to attend felt like the kind of twisted irony you can only find in families where guilt is the currency. My father chimed in a few minutes later with his usual measured tone, the one he uses to sound reasonable while he takes her side, telling me that I had made things harder on everyone and that I should have focused on the positive. I stared at those words and thought about every single time I had been told to be grateful, to stay quiet, to not make waves, and the anger that had been simmering all night started to crystallize into something sharper. Something that made me feel steadier rather than weaker. I typed back a reply that was probably longer than it needed to be, but it felt necessary. I wrote that what was embarrassing was the fact that my seat had been empty while they stood at a golf course clapping for Ethan, that I did not say anything I didn't mean, and that the truth only hurts when you know it's real. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and the satisfaction of not watering it down for once was worth whatever fallout was coming. By the time I reached my car, my cousin had sent a message that just said "finally" with 3 exclamation marks, and a couple of classmates had texted me things like, "That was epic," and "I wish I had the guts to say that to my parents." And it reminded me that sometimes telling the truth out loud is not only about your own fight, but also about giving language to people who are still stuck in theirs. Of course, the family group chat lit up like a fire. An aunt tried to play peacemaker by saying that parents make mistakes, but kids should still be respectful, and one of my uncles, who has always been blunt, wrote that maybe my parents should think about why their daughter felt the need to humiliate them in public if they were such perfect parents. I could practically hear my mother's gasp from miles away. Ethan eventually jumped in with his predictable defense, telling me not to make this about him, and claiming that he never asked them to come to his outing instead of my banquet, as if the problem was about scheduling logistics rather than decades of favoritism. He wrote that I had embarrassed him too, because people at the golf course were apparently sending him my quote and laughing about how harsh I had been. I read his words 3 times and realized he still didn't get it, that he was more concerned with how he looked in front of his friends than with how I felt sitting at a table with 2 fake name cards. I typed back that it became about him the second they posted smiling photos at his event while pretending they were too busy to be at mine, and that maybe if he stopped acting like the world was built to orbit him, he would see why I said what I did. The silence that followed in the chat was almost louder than the messages, and I knew I had finally cut through the rehearsed lines they always used to shut me down. Still, I could feel the shift in the air, the one that tells you a confrontation is not over but just postponed. I scrolled through more texts from extended family who said they were proud of me, and I could not ignore the satisfaction that came with knowing some people had been watching this imbalance for years and were secretly rooting for me to say something. For once, the story was not being rewritten to make me the jealous sibling or the problem child. For once, the spotlight they usually aimed at Ethan had swiveled and burned a little uncomfortably on them. Just when I thought I might finally catch my breath, a notification popped up that Ethan had tagged me in a vague post about family loyalty, with a caption about how public disrespect is worse than private mistakes, which was his passive-aggressive way of turning himself into the victim while pretending not to mention me by name. I rolled my eyes so hard it hurt, but before I could decide whether to respond or ignore it, a direct message came through from a friend who had been at the banquet, and it simply said, "He's waiting for you in the parking lot." For a second, I considered leaving through another exit, but the truth is I had been waiting for this showdown as much as he had. It was not going to be solved in group texts or half-truths anymore. If Ethan wanted to confront me, then I was finally ready to confront him back, because I was done protecting his comfort at the expense of my own dignity. So I slipped my phone into my bag, locked my car, and walked toward the far side of the lot where I could already see his shape under the lamplight, pacing like he had been rehearsing whatever self-righteous speech he was about to deliver. I tightened my grip on my bag strap and told myself this was the moment where all the swallowed words would finally land, not on a stage this time, but in the only place they might ever actually be heard. When I walked across that parking lot and saw Ethan waiting for me, I could already feel the tension radiating off him, because he was pacing in circles with his hands clenched and his jaw set in that way he always had when he was about to lecture me. As though he had earned the right to be the family spokesman simply because he was the one who could swing a golf club. I approached slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted him to know that I was not rushing, that I was not intimidated, that I had finally decided I would never again shrink myself just to keep him from exploding. When I got close enough, he stopped pacing and turned on me with that furious, self-righteous tone that I knew too well, the one he always used when he was caught in the wrong but needed to flip the blame onto me. He said I had humiliated the entire family, that my words had made them look like terrible parents, and that I had made him look like some spoiled brat in front of his friends. I let him talk without interrupting, because for once I did not feel the need to defend myself immediately. I watched his face get redder, his words get sharper, and all I could think was how familiar the scene was, except in the past I would have crumbled, apologized, tried to fix things so everyone would calm down. Not this time. When he finally stopped long enough to catch his breath, I told him calmly that he was angry not because I lied, but because I told the truth in front of people who could no longer unhear it. I reminded him that our parents had chosen to skip my biggest moment in order to post smiling pictures at his golf outing, and I said if that embarrassed them, maybe they should ask themselves why it stung so much. He tried to cut me off, insisting again that he never told them to pick him over me, that he did not ask for the favoritism, that he was just living his life. But I stopped him and said that just because he did not ask for it did not mean he was innocent, because he had enjoyed every second of being the golden child while watching me fade into the background. I said he had stood by while our parents made me feel like a second thought for years, and that his silence was just as loud as their absence. I could see the words land, because he opened his mouth and then closed it again, like he could not find the easy comeback that always used to roll off his tongue. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not the one on trial. I told him that what happened on stage was not about humiliating him, it was about reclaiming the part of myself that had been shoved aside every holiday, every school event, every time I was told to understand that they were busy with him. I said that night I chose to stop understanding, to stop excusing, to stop pretending I was okay with being invisible in my own family. He tried again to insist that I was blowing things out of proportion, but I cut him off with the line I had been holding back for years, the one that left no room for argument. Family shows up, and if they do not, then they are just people you happen to share a house with, and I was done treating absence like love. The silence after that was heavier than anything he had thrown at me, and for once he looked like the one who did not know where to go from here. His face was still red, but now it was less rage and more the kind of stunned realization that he had finally lost the upper hand. He muttered something about me regretting this, about how I was burning bridges, and I told him plainly that maybe some bridges deserved to burn if they only ever led me back to places where I was not valued. I turned to leave before he could start another round, because I did not need to hear more recycled excuses or half-hearted threats. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of everything I had carried for years lifting, not completely, but enough that I could breathe differently. I knew my parents would keep spinning their story, I knew Ethan would keep playing the victim, and I knew the family chat would keep buzzing with attempts to smooth things over, but none of that mattered anymore. Because I had finally said out loud what I had been saying to myself in silence for too long. They could deny it, they could twist it, they could even cut me out if they wanted, but they could never take back the moment I refused to play along. When I closed the car door and sat there with my hands still shaking from adrenaline, I realized that what I felt was not guilt or sadness, but a kind of raw relief, like I had finally drawn a line in permanent ink instead of pencil. I drove away knowing that the night would live in family lore as the evening I embarrassed them, but to me it would always be the night I stopped apologizing for existing. And as much as the story might remain unfinished in their eyes, in mine it had already ended exactly the way it needed to. I won, because I finally made myself impossible to ignore.